microphones. So if you could just wait for the microphone to come round. I ask just one thing. Could you please just ask one question? If there's time, we'll go around the room again. But in the first instance, just one question. So over to you guys.
Just been asked to say who I am. I'm David Brunt from Axon Nobel. I'm interested in EPNL, and I should have done my homework. But could you help me out and explain what's the difference between an EPNL and what's done for you versus an environmental profile, organizational environmental profile? So what's the difference that putting a monetary value on it makes?
Well, it helps me to put impacts into relation to each other. If, for example, a ton of carbon versus 1,000 liters of water, does it tell me what's worse in my business and what isn't? Versus, you know, cubic meters, air pollution, land use. You know, I can't put hectares, liters, and cubic meters into relationship to each other. Once I monetize them, then I have one currency that ultimately tells me which one has the bigger impact. Now, for an engineer, you know, technical person, it may be obvious. For me as a CEO, it wasn't. So if I now look at it and I can actually say, well, carbon versus water versus pollution versus waste versus land use throughout the entire supply chain, tier 1, 2, 3, 4, and my own operations, and I see now on one page where the biggest impact really is. So that's the difference. It just takes it one level further and puts everything into relation to each other.
Hi, it's Mark Chadwick from Carbon Clear. And this is a fascinating idea. Are there any steps being taken to harmonize the conversion that different companies would use between some environmental externality and a dollar value to allow comparability between different companies?
Call in the B team for that. That's the plan.
Question to the lady at the front.
Hi, Verity Lawson from BAT. I was just wondering if you've ever considered or are considering in the future expanding the P&L to cover social impacts as well as environmental.
Yeah, we've just completed a feasibility study on the social P&L as well. I haven't seen the results, so I can't really give you a proper answer. The EP&L has a lot of social impacts already incorporated. I mean, for example, we're looking at the social cost of carbon, for example. And of course, you know, climate change has an immediate impact on society as well. So a lot of impacts through the EP&L will impact society as well. But we are also looking at pure social factors that are not environmentally driven. We will, well, I thought we would already be able to make a decision of whether we think we can do an EP&L. We've just, as I mentioned, completed the feasibility study. We've talked to experts. I think it can be done, but of course there are some qualitative factors that are harder to put into monetary terms, for sure. You can put them into numbers, but monetary terms, it gets difficult. How you put human rights into monetary terms, for example. So we're looking at it, but if it can be done as like the EP&L, I'm not sure yet.
Hi, Simon Abrams from Ernst & Young. Jochen, thank you very much for a very insightful and inspirational talk. I was just reflecting on the idea that, for example, you said that the decisions that you make on the supply chain have the most impact. So you look at leather and you look at, say, for example, rubber. But the people who are working on the rubber plantations they have jobs, it gives them a livelihood. If you then decide that that's not environmentally sustainable, then you have a huge negative impact on that economy. How do you balance those sorts of issues?
No, I mean, that's a very good point, but of course you can also make a rubber plantation more sustainable, and you can make cotton farming more sustainable too. So it doesn't mean that everyone will go out of business. You know, you can take raw materials and make them more sustainable. And you know, the people that build their livelihoods on, you know, small cattle farming are usually not the ones that, you know, do it on a big scale, which becomes the commercial operation. So I would say those businesses could afford, you know, to make cattle farming less unsustainable. But when it comes to finding substitutes, of course, you know, some of those substitute materials may impact certain industries and employments in those industries, which, if you look at the social P&L, could potentially take some people out of business. So, I mean, that's absolutely correct, and one has to look at it very carefully. So you can't just say, you know, overnight, now we're switching over and you guys are out of business. I think there are steps in between. And just like we are moving, you know, from traditional mining that has been subsidized for decades in many countries to saying, you know, we are helping you to find new livelihoods, you will have to find ways to transition certain economies and industries as well into a new economy. So I think those mechanisms will need to be put into place as soon as we really have some more sustainable materials and solutions. So that's an impact that, when you look at the social side, you know, could potentially be a negative. But there are lots of steps one could take in between.
Nikki Chambers from Best Foot Forward. How will you know when you've got there?
How do I know?
How will you know where you've got there when you are truly sustainable? What does sustainability absolutely look like?
Well, the theory would say when I do no longer have a negative impact. That's the theory, and that's where I think it gets tricky, because, you know, we are sort of, we like closed loop, we like cradle to cradle and all of these things that we've invented, but when you actually look at the theory and then look at the practice, there's a big gap in between, because, you know, our in-cycle products actually reduce our environmental impact by 31%, and it's a closed loop. So you would say, well, actually it's closed loop, we're fine, we're happy, right? But that's not the case, because the first, you know, time to actually produce your raw material, you know, doesn't, in terms of negative impact, doesn't make up for or isn't made up through the closing of the loop. So, you know, to actually have a zero impact is probably impossible. So we may have to, down the road, define sustainability in a way that mankind has a negative impact, but nature is still able to recoup and to function properly without degrading any further. To believe, I mean, we basically have to not exist any longer as humans to say we are totally sustainable, and that can't be the definition, obviously, as we all agree. So we'll have to define at some point a threshold that says we will have a negative impact that nature can sustain without further degradation. That probably will be a definition. What that point is, I don't know, but can we continue to live, you know, and utilize X planets a year? Probably not. We'll have to find ways that, you know, get us back to using resources so that they don't, you know, lead to further deterioration of our planet, whatever that may mean. Unless you have a better definition, that's what I can come up with quickly. But the zero bottom line, you know, that I just don't think is realistic. Of course, what you can do, and that's why it's an environmental profit and loss, there also can be profits. You're reducing on one side, and you may have a negative impact, but you do have a possibility to also not offset in a way by just buying some credits, but you have possibilities to compensate your negative impact through initiatives that you're starting that actually have a positive effect. So if business, for every negative impact it has, will also say, well, I'm doing something to offset that negative impact, we will at least move in the right direction. Right now, none of that is still happening because the markets are not created, businesses are not getting rewarded for it, or they're not getting penalized for having a negative impact. But eventually, we'll have to also look at a positive impact on our EP&L by businesses trying and actually finding a solution, not just to reduce, but actually also give something back.
Ian Blythe from, sorry, is that on? Yes. Yeah, Ian Blythe from Boots. How long does one of these EP&L processes actually take, and could we ever use it for FMCG?
I think, it depends on the complexity of your business, but from the idea to creation was 2 years. So I think that was actually really from not knowing what an EP&L should look like. I'd say any business, if you have decent data collection, can do an EP&L, within 12 months. And it's not that costly if you look at the bigger scale of business. Of course, for small, mid-sized companies, it's a big undertaking initially, if you don't have the data. But there's, from my opinion, no big business that can say it's either not worth it or too costly, because it really isn't. It's totally worth doing, because you really know where your impacts are, and it isn't that expensive considering a big business and what it costs, to do many other things in operations. So I'd say there's really no excuse for big business not to do it. And it'll, as I said, for 20 years, I've been blind running my business as a CEO because I really didn't know where my impacts are. Now I do. So it was a huge eye-opener for myself.
Stephen Lang from Ernst & Young, just picking up on the point about the need to go beyond being less unsustainable to being restorative. How far away are you from having a net positive training shoe?
As a company? Very far away. Very far away, because if I take full responsibility for the entire supply chain, which I do, I'm not just defining my responsibility as the 6% of the total footprint, which out of the 145 million, 6% is my own footprint. So I could say I make my operations net positive and I'm the hero, but the reality is, what about the other 94%? So if I really look at the entire supply chain, we are far, far away. I'd say, 20, 25, and even then we wouldn't be at a net zero. I think that's, again, very unrealistic. But, can we halve our entire footprint by 2020 if we really wanted to? Yes, assuming that we find alternative materials that we can use. And assuming that recycling as an industry will become, more of a given. But I could just give you one practical example. Right now, we are penalizing, by importing certain raw materials into the EU, we are getting penalized because leather has the lowest import duty versus materials that I would consider more sustainable today. So the reality is, if we started to incentivize in the EU, not by saying, because it's been 100 years like that, that leather has 8% import duty or 7% versus synthetic 20%, which derived from the times that we were scared that the Chinese, would just flood Europe. And we would said, well, actually, we pay our import duties based on environmental impacts very quickly. Would you see a dramatic change in the types of material that we are using as an industry? So, we as businesses actually have a great opportunity to lobby also, the EU and say, why don't you put tariffs and define tariffs based on environmental impact, rather than on something that is totally antiquated. So changing a perverse incentive system, which is actually decentivizing the use of more sustainable materials, would give us a dramatic change. If I said I have to do that as a business myself, it would be very difficult, but that's why I'm saying I'm getting out of business and doing something like the B team, because as a B team, hopefully we will have an opportunity. Nobody thinks that I'm trying to create something for my own business that ultimately will only help me. So as a B team, we want to also lobby against perverse incentives and really try and push incentives that are environmentally more friendly.
Jochen, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I work in the service sector, and I suspect a lot of businesses represented here tonight will also do the same. What would be your recommendations for EP&L for somebody who doesn't really have an import of materials or use solid materials, accountancy or stockbrokering or professional services, that kind of thing? Where would you think that part of the business world should focus its attention?
Well, talking about accountants, you know, Peter Barker from the World Business Council, he said to me in Rio, he said, accountants can save the world. You know, so let's make sure that we are accounting for externalities. And I think, you know, the service sector or consultants in general have a tremendous opportunity actually to come up with solutions to our environmental problems that are by defining or creating new methodologies that help us to you know, to actually make business better. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for, you know, accountants, for, you know, the auditors and any other service provider that doesn't have a big footprint, but can help to find solutions to a more sustainable level. And everyone has a footprint, even accountants have a footprint that they can measure. So let them start measuring their own environmental footprint first, maybe.
Any more questions? We've got about 5 minutes left, so time for 2 or 3 more questions, if there are any.
Dutan from Metrolite. I'm sitting on the technology table, so I will ask a technology question. It sounds like a very complex task. Did you use or develop an application, a software application, to manage this?
Data collection, you mean? Not yet, but you know, there you go. You know.
Yeah, a complex, any complex operation, a software application or a management application. If you take SAP or Oracle application from the accounting world that manage all the supply chain, and if you take the EP&L and you take different areas from different business unit and you want to manage it in a constant way, obviously technology could be a big support.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, technology that helps you to take the find, not just to do an EP&L, but to actually use it in business. So, you know, what do you do with this data until you've broken it down to your developers, designers, accountants, and everyone else, because you need to break the EP&L down. That's very important. And for example, the Apparel Coalition, you know, as a group, it's going to be called the Apparel and Footwear Coalition, which unites, you know, brands to basically work together to find solutions, sustainable solutions. We're trying to develop a tool which is software-based, technology-based, that will help developers to make the decision at that moment and when they're creating a product, so that when they say, I'm using this material, it will tell them, well, you may want to use that material because that's more sustainable, or your environmental impact is now put into relationship to another material. So the developer actually and designer has a tool that visualizes an impact and allows them to create a more sustainable product from the get-go. So those are the kind of applications that we need throughout every function in business, and I think that's where, you know, technology will play a very important role, helping us to, you know, to really make it simple for everyone to implement. That's one example, but I think that can be taken throughout any function in a corporation. As soon as we start incorporating sustainable thinking and break it down to an operational level, that's where technology comes in and will have to come into play.
Hi, I'm Nancy Hillpass from Barclays. I was just wondering how you value things that aren't obviously, you know, have money associated to them, like land use change. Like, that's a very tough issue to pick up on, and obviously it requires a huge amount of thought.
Yes, and there are valuations to do exactly that, and it's looking at land use, you know, in areas of high biodiversity versus lower biodiversity. When was the land converted, you know, recently or 80 years ago? So, I mean, all of that is taken into consideration when you look at land use. Now, the one area that is hard to define is biodiversity. How do you actually value biodiversity? We do it indirectly through land use because it has an impact on biodiversity when you change land use from, you know, nature state to commercial use. So it is taken into consideration, but eventually we will have to create a tool that also can value biodiversity. But that is, I would say, overall in the early goings, and, you know, sustaining one species versus another and is a very complex one to do. But I'm sure, you know, 3-4 years from now, we will also have tools to value biodiversity as one parameter.
Truman Siemens from Green Order. So what is your position on offsets? Do you envision a situation where once you get this clarity that there can be unlimited offsetting to an optimum?
Well, I do believe that offset schemes are, you know, are good, but of course it can't just be the only. I mean, the first priority has to be to find solutions to reduce your impact. And if you then have tried everything, then you may say, well, what could be initiatives that help me where I'm actually creating an impact to reverse the negative impact? So you still want to keep in your sphere of operation. So if you've done a mess, you've got to clean it up, so to speak. If that doesn't work, well, then you also may need to look at certain offset schemes. I do believe offsets are important, and we actually buying our offsets from Wildlife Works, which is a company that started in Kenya. It's now managing land in many other countries, the first RED Plus certified. And we actually became a shareholder in Wildlife Works as well, because we believe it's a business model that can sustain itself also financially. So I think it is something that should happen. It's not happening yet. It will take time, but it's a good thing. But again, you start with your own operation first, reduce, create a positive impact where you have created a negative impact, and if that doesn't help, then, you know, you look at offsets. But credible offsets, that's the key, because there's a lot out there that is also not that great.
Okay, I think time for one last question.
My name is Evelina Mayer. I work for Balfa BT. I would be interested if you could give us any tips on supply chain engagement, because I think they have quite a big impact on what we do as big companies, and we kind of find it that it's really hard to get them to the level we expect them. So I would like to hear from you what tips you could give us. Thank you.
Well, I think it's about capacity building initiatives that you can do, and you can also, as an industry, I mean, you have a body. Every industry has a body that sort of speaks on your behalf, right? So why don't we start working with our, you know, bodies and organizations to try and find sustainable solutions throughout the entire supply chain? So I think you can go at it on your own, which I would advise, but you can only take it so far yourself, and then you need to partner with other corporations and your own organizations to find solutions throughout the supply chain. But, you know, the further or the less you are integrated in your business throughout your supply chain, the harder it gets to really change the supply chain. But it does start with capacity building. I mean, for example, we are partner in the cotton project that is bringing, you know, farmers together in Africa to harvest cotton more sustainably, and we've actually created a market for them. They've reduced their chemical use dramatically. We've given them a chance to get proper pricing on the cotton, and it's something that's really working. Is it sustainable? No, it's not, but it's a lot less damaging what it used to be. So I think there are ways of working with other partners in the industry to create more sustainable solutions as well.
Okay, I'm told we've got one quick one left.
Neil McIndoe from Truecost. There's an advertising campaign that runs for Praktique watches, which says you don't actually own one, you look after it for the next generation. Now, my son has started borrowing my trainers. Do you imagine a time where PUMA shoes could be handed down from father to son?
Well, I actually still have my pair of PUMA trainers that I wore when I was 16, so I never threw them out. They're a collector's item. It depends how much your son is actually wearing the shoes every day, and if he's running a marathon, I would say probably you don't want to pass them on. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't outrule that, you know, but that's not really the question, because you can also use something up very quickly as long as it isn't wasted, you know, and rather than throwing a shoe on landfill, I would hope that 5 to 10 years from now, we will know what to do with the shoe that you will not use any longer. So I don't think it's just necessarily about passing something on. It's about, you know, trying to use something and use it again and use it again so that it has a use and never goes out of use, so to speak, whether it's your son or, you know, somebody else that does something with your shoe, upcycling, downcycling, or something else. So, but we have to definitely look at every product that we create in that way. We have at some point to say things that end up in the garden or landfill have to end up because, you know, they can biodegrade and that's the end of it. So at least we're giving a little bit back to nature, but something that just ends up on landfill, I think those days will have to be counted. Also for sports shoes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have run out of time.
Great.
So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Jochen, sorry, thank you very much again, and I just think the ambition for everyone to be doing EP&Ls in 10 years' time is fantastic, and I love your advocacy. Just in case there are people here who are inspired to go down the EP&L journey, is there a working group, or would you send them any particular direction?
No, they can come to me now, and then I'll pass them on to the right party.
Okay, so
those that are really serious could definitely come to me.
Okay, there you go, you've got it. Just a couple of points. We've got Green Strategy on the 14th of November. That's we're crowdsourcing. We've got Pop Idol meets crowdsourcing in Idea Idol. It's kind of crazy, but it's fun and it's also serious. It's about how do you change supply chains, how do you change consumer behavior. We've got 46 submissions have gone in. The judging panels meet this week, and then it all happens at Green Strategy. I'm glad to say EP&Ls are one of the submissions into that competition. And just the final thing is FIFO. If you wouldn't mind filling in FIFO, it helps us to continuously improve these events. So it's roundtables next, but thank you again to Jochen.